I'm back with part two of the Four Horsemen of the Autonomic Apocalypse, is what I call it. We start out with the cycle of depression and how anxiety becomes a part of that, and then how addiction can be connected to it, along with some other compulsive behaviors. And it can be the Four Horsemen because they can all team up to make our life pretty miserable. So, I want to just go over a little bit of the physiology in this session and some of the things that we can do about it. And hopefully, I'll be able to get far enough along to cover a lot of those things that we can do about it. If not, we'll just do part three. So, right now, we're going to do a summary, and I'm just going to bring up my slides here. We're going to do a little bit of a summary of part one, but it's really important for you to go back and watch part one because there's a lot of information about this cycle. And I'm going to kind of go through it pretty quickly right now, just to give you a good summary, a good head start. So this is the psychology of the cycle of depression. That's where it all starts. And if you look at that 6 o'clock spot down there at the bottom of the circle, you see the little depressive thinking style, the part that has the hopelessness or the helplessness or the worthlessness, and maybe I'll never get what I want, or this is a catastrophe, or a lot of the kind of thoughts that we have that can create a sense of hopelessness and helplessness, and sometimes even connect us with the feeling of I'm not good enough and I'm not worthy. And so all those depressive thinking styles trigger that sympathetic stress response, which is the survival mode. And so there's a threat to the system. And that threat to the system, when it triggers that stress response, also triggers what I call the ruminator, which is that part of me that tries to figure out several things. It tries to figure out, okay, what's going on? What do we need to do about it? Putting a plan together to deal with it, enacting that plan, and then closing that loop, basically. But with these depressive thoughts, a lot of those are from core beliefs or limiting beliefs that we generate in childhood or along the way in our developmental processes, and they stick with us. We live our life as if they're true, and we look for evidence of them. So they get pretty ingrained in the very foundations of our neural circuitry. And so a lot of those loops that come from those core beliefs cannot be closed. But the ruminator continues to chew on them and stew on them and try to resolve and solve them. And so there's a lot of ruminating on negativity. You know, if you wonder why we step into the negative and we kind of breeze through the positive, we spend our time just stewing on the negative, that's because a threat has been generated by the depressive thinking. And when the survival mode kicks in, then that threat triggers the ruminator. If it's something that is positive or enjoyable, we just enjoy that moment and go on. We don't chew on it and stew on it, which maybe we should. But the ruminator works overtime. And then by the time we go to sleep, we still have a lot of open loops if we've got a lot of those core beliefs or a lot of stress in our life. And so when we go to sleep with those open loops, the subconscious comes in with the metaphorical scenarios that we call dreams to try and close some of those open loops while we sleep. So the conscious mind is sleeping, and all the energy that's really devoted to the system maintenance that the subconscious is supposed to be doing gets burned up or used up by trying to close those open loops with those over dreaming, if you will, rapid eye movement sleep, and not getting into a deep enough recuperative sleep. And so we can go all night long dumping adrenaline and cortisol and all kinds of stress hormones into our system when we should be getting rest and recuperation. So even if we got several hours of sleep, 8 or 9 hours of sleep, we can wake up feeling tired and exhausted by morning. And that starts that other loop of loss of motivation, not really getting an enjoyment in life because I don't engage in life. I withdraw from people, and my serotonin levels drop. So the doctor gives me some serotonin reuptake inhibitors to try and raise my mood, and nothing really works very well. So then the grouch comes out, and I feel irritable, and I don't really connect well with other people because I'm not in a good mood, and who wants to be around somebody who's not in a good mood? And so then I don't take care of, I don't have ambition or motivation, so I don't take care of my daily needs. Like I don't live up to my goals in life, and I don't even think about that. And maybe I don't exercise, or I don't eat well, and so forth. So if I go around and around and around that loop, it's going to get pretty bad at some point. And then the inner critic jumps up, and the inner critic starts beating up on the depressive thinker for not figuring things out and for having all these problems. Well, you should do this, or you should do that, or this is a catastrophe, or what's wrong with you? You're never going to make it. You're never going to be happy. So that makes the depressive thinking even worse, which then starts to create some chaos. And the ruminator over there has to figure out now, what do I need to do to hold all this together, because it's starting to fall apart. And so it comes up with these things, the addictive or compulsive behaviors, smoking or drinking or drugging or sexing or gambling, or even working too much, or taking care of needy people, or doing something else to get me off of that hamster wheel. And these are the only things that seem to help, and it's only in the short term. But then the inner critic and other parts realize that these things are not going to help. These things are only going to make it worse. Yeah, there might be a little short-term payoff, but then come the DWIs, or the loss of my job, or the broken relationship, or whatever. And so the inner critic sees that coming, and I start beating myself up after every binge. And the ruminator then has to figure out a way to protect those behaviors, because it's all he's got. That's all he can figure out to do. And it seems to be the only thing that helps. And so he has to create a protector. And we use the king baby, or the natural fun-loving part, that is working in concert with the ruminator. And the two of them create a wall of denial to protect that addictive or compulsive behavior, because it's all they've got. And so now you got a fight between the king baby, if you will, and the inner critic. And most of us can relate to this whenever we feel that we're overweight and we want to go on a diet. The inner critic says, we're going to eat right, and we're going to do this discipline for these next several weeks, and we're going to lose weight and fit our clothes and feel better. And the king baby is in the pantry eating everything that's available. And so those two parts will end up fighting against each other. So this is all the psychology of that cycle of depression. And since it triggers that sympathetic stress response, the anxiety increases, and then these addictive behaviors come out of a need for comfort and relief, and they don't work very long, and they end up causing more trouble than they are there to solve. But the king baby continues to protect that. So that's the psychology of it. And it can just continue to grow until we have no choice and we hit bottom. Now let's talk a little bit before we get into what we can start to do about it. This is a psychology, and it's very hard to change by itself. So this is part of why that is. We go on here. I want to talk a little bit about the biology of this cycle. So our survival systems, there's three silos, if you will: the eat, don't get eaten, and reproduce systems. Those are survival systems that are located deep in the midbrain, in the area that called the nucleus accumbens. And these parts, or these systems, help us survive. And they're, again, deep inside that midbrain, so they're not in the outer regions of the brain. So eat is a compulsion that we have that starts if we want to nourish the body and we need to live. If we don't eat, we're going to die. If we get eaten, we're going to die. If we don't reproduce, then we're all going to die. So we need to obey these and take care of these systems. And so each of them have their own built-in needs. The need for the eat system, which nourishes my body, is food. The need for the don't get eaten system is a need for shelter or safety. And the need for reproducing is sex or connection. So how do we know when it's time to eat? And the body needs nourishment, I get hungry. How do I know I need to seek shelter and safety? My anxiety and fear gets triggered. How do I know it's time to get close and intimate? I have a longing that gets triggered. So these are the triggers. And what do they trigger? Well, before we talk about that, let's talk about how they get triggered. Um, Hunger, for instance. Let's say that I'm working on a project and lunchtime comes, but I'm on a roll, so I work right straight through lunch. Maybe at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, I feel a little gnawing in my stomach. I don't obey that gnawing. It's hunger that's starting to grow, and I'm on a roll, so I want to keep going. I push right on through supper. But eventually, I can't put off eating, and I can't disobey that hunger trigger for very long before I start feeling a compulsion to eat. And it can get so bad that I'll eat a crusty piece of moldy bread or drink stagnant water if that's all that's available. So, how does that hunger grow? That has to do with the neurochemical called dopamine, and there's another one called serotonin. And most of us realize that those are household words anymore. Dopamine and serotonin. We're learning a lot about how they function in the brain, but what we're learning mostly about is how they function as neurotransmitters in the outer brain. They're the feel good drugs, the ones that make us feel safe and secure and happy and content, and it's the ones that give us the motivation to go on. And so in the outer brain and the thinking brain, or the cortical regions of the brain out there, they are neurotransmitters. And in this area, though, in the nucleus accumbens, where these survival systems are, they don't function as neurotransmitters, they function as neuromodulators. To modulate is to turn up the volume or turn down the volume. And dopamine rises in the nucleus accumbens in this area when it's time to eat. And that's that hunger signal. And as the dopamine rises, that signal gets stronger. It's modulating that signal so that it's turning up the volume on it. And if I disobey that signal, then that dopamine continues to rise to a point where it gets pretty high, and I feel that compulsion when it's way up here. Well, if I eat, when I stop and eat finally, then the serotonin will rise in that area, get to the same level, satiate the need, and reset the system so that now the hunger goes away because there's satiation. And same thing with anxiety and fear. If I need to outrun a tiger, dopamine is rising until I find that safety and that shelter, and it's over and the threat is gone. Then I get serotonin bump that resets the system. And the same for longing and so forth. So those triggers will trigger the arousal of the need, and then an urge to take action to meet that need. And when that need gets met, then the balance is restored, and I get that got it feeling, that off switch, and that's from that serotonin bump. And then if I don't get that need met, then the need increases, the urgency of it increases, and I feel more and more compelled to meet that need. And when I find a way to meet that need, then again, I get that off switch. If I can't find a way to meet that need, or there's no food or shelter, then I have obsession and compulsion. I gotta have it, and so I'm starting to feel anxiety through the roof. I'm hyper aroused. The survival instinct is at the maximum, and so I've got to continue obsessively, compulsively trying to satiate that need. So that's how the survival systems work. Now the problem here is that when we find something that can ring the bell, because in this, let me talk about that for a minute. In the nucleus accumbens, there's also the reward center of the brain, or the reward pathway is in that same area. And I call it ringing the bell. Like if you go to a carnival and you take that big hammer and you hit that pad, then you can ring the bell if you hit it just right. Well, we all have something that can ring the bell for us in that reward center. And such as when I'm going through that addictive cycle, or that cycle of depression and so forth, and things are getting out of control, the ruminator comes up with those ways to feel better. Well, one of them might be to drink or drug or eat. Another one might be to have an obsessive thought or distracting thoughts, and catastrophes and other kinds of depressive thinking styles. And then I can have sex addictions or gambling addictions or other behavioral addictions. Well, the ingestive addictions inappropriately get wired into that eat system. And the obsessive compulsive intrusive thinking and obsessions will get wired into the don't get eaten thing. This is where the anxiety, fears, and phobias, worries, anxieties, and fears come in. And by thinking and being distractions, even like counting or checking or doing some things like that, we wonder what those repetitive behaviors are for. Well, they get us off that hamster wheel of that depression. They get us out there thinking about something else. But the problem is, and the anxiety continues to grow because we think about things that are anxiety producing, intrusive, obsessive thoughts. And we don't feel safe until we count or check or do enough of what we're doing. And then the behavioral addictions get wired into the reproduce silo over there. Sex addiction and gambling addictions, behavioral addictions. So they get wired inappropriately into that. And so since it's an abnormal connection, it's not supposed to be in that area, then it doesn't function well very often. In other words, let's say out of 10 times, maybe when someone takes a drink or smokes a joint or eats too much, they might get they might get that serotonin bump. The dopamine rises, signaling the need for alcohol, drugs, or sex, but then sometimes it doesn't get a high enough serotonin bump, and so it doesn't reset the system. Sometimes it will go all the way up and it will reset the system, and that makes it difficult because sometimes I can handle it and sometimes I can't. It's those times I can't that are unpredictable, and so they cause problems and compulsions and addictions and all that. So those get wired into these survival systems inappropriately. Taking a closer look at that, let's take alcohol, for instance. So with alcohol or any other addictive or compulsive behavior, there's always an on trigger, and that's the rise of dopamine. Maybe it's the jingling of ice in a glass, or it's after work on Friday afternoon, or a certain time of day. The dopamine rises, signaling an urge or a craving to use after a while. But the urge might just be the first sign of that dopamine rising. Well, if I resist that either voluntarily or involuntarily, maybe I'm in treatment trying to get better, or I'm in jail and there's no supply, then that dopamine continues to rise. And then the anxiety continues to increase and the cravings get stronger and stronger until eventually I have to obey the signal and use that drug of choice. But there's no off switch. So I use until I fall out, pass out, or run out. So my other choice is to substitute something. And if it's another drug or a compulsive behavior, again, there's no serotonin bump that's going to reset the system. So what is my other option? Well, with brain imaging techniques and so forth, we know now that positive things like recovery activities will give us that serotonin bump that we need to reset the system, and that's your off switch for the compulsive or obsessive or addictive behavior. And so I think that's why the 12-step programs work so well. Number one, they take care of the thinking of, the depressive thinking styles. We replace those with positive cliches, and the cliches are cliche because they work, like this too shall pass, and let go and let God, or the serenity prayer, and those things can help that serotonin level rise. Reaching out, calling a sponsor, calling a friend, talking to somebody about what's going on, that can cause this serotonin bump sufficient to be the off switch. Going to a meeting, doing the positive recovery activities actually resets the system. So that's the physiology or the biology of this addictive, compulsive, depressive anxiety that comes with as a team, and it gets worse and worse, and they all kind of feed into each other. So what do we do about it? Well, this is the psychology. So people say, well, why don't you just think positive? Yeah, that's a little difficult with all this going on, especially since I've got all this biology going at the same time. I can think in positive thought, but it's not going to just one or two of those is not going to help. I need to be able to rework this physiology as well. So I need to keep doing what I'm doing and find some sort of program that I can use. It's real simple. They say all I got to do is change my whole life. And it starts with that depressive thinking style, and then the ruminator and the king baby. I've got to undo that. I've got to reverse that cycle. So what are some ways of doing that? Take a look there. We have, well, before we go on, if you've seen the iceberg model by now, then you know that this is going to create a lot of stress. It's going to create a lot of depressive thinking. It's going to create a lot of stewing and chewing from the ruminator, trying to figure out what's going on and what do I do about it. I can't generate any comfort and relief on the inside when I've got all that abandonment, shame, and contempt. And so I have to find something on the outside to bring a sense of comfort and relief. That's where the firefighters or the addictive processes come in. So this is making it worse. If I've got a history of child abuse or sexual abuse or emotional abuse, or if I'm just have growing up in a dysfunctional family to some degree, mild, moderate, or severe, then I can carry a lot of this emotional baggage into the problem. And then that abandonment, shame, and contempt becomes an issue because we have these two drives, if you will, self-actualization and self-preservation. Self-actualization is growth mode or recovery mode if we're in recovery. And then when we get triggered into self-preservation, that's survival mode. And when we get triggered into self-preservation, that whole flow chart underneath will light up and power on. And that's your stress response. And that signals all the parts that we're going to talk about to become reactive. And that's where we have these reactions, because we have built into our system some normal survival parts of self, if you will. We have parts that fight, and we have parts that want to escape, or flight parts, and then we have freeze parts that collapse and submit, fall into the abandonment, shame, and contempt. Or then we have the submit part that's impression management and trying to keep everybody happy. And then we have this strong need for connection and powerful fear of abandonment when we have abandonment wounds, because these aren't the problems. We need to fight, flight, freeze, and submit sometimes. And like, for instance, the fight part, if I'm in a dark alley and someone tries to mug me and I've got a baseball bat, I want to start swinging. The flight part is maybe I'm working too hard during the week. I want to run to the beach on the weekend. That's a healthy use of the flight mode. If I have the flu, I want to collapse into the bed and my freeze part take over so that I can shut my body down and eat some chicken soup and get better. And then the submit part, I may want to give in to somebody else's desires, especially if it's my boss or someone else. So okay, so let's go through. Yeah, so those are healthy parts of a normal personality, but these wounds, the wound of abandonment and the infection of shame and the scab of contempt that we saw back at the iceberg model, that forms a lens through which all these other parts are reactive. And so then the fight, flight, freeze, submit, and attachment parts of our personality will create a lot of survival skills. And the fight part will have angry outbursts or inner critics or difficulty trusting or punitive, controlling, or even suicidal or antidepressant thinking, like anti-dependent thinking, like I don't need you, I don't need anybody. The fight part just wants to separate. And then there's these other unhealthy flight parts that can get developed or can develop through this, like again, the addictive behaviors, the compulsive behaviors, the poor self-discipline, the addictions, freeze parts where all the phobias and fears and anxieties are, and we collapse into that and freeze and shut down and become immobile. And then the submit parts, trying to make sure everybody's happy all the time for fear of being rejected or abandoned. So we'll come back, and there's another video on this one and the iceberg model that you can look at as well. I just want to touch on them right now to give you a little sense of where we're going to need to go to deal with this. So these parts that are survival skills that we learn are not real helpful in adulthood because they end up causing trouble, and they seek to solve problems, but they usually cause more problems than they solve. And this is why this is a language of reactivity when those parts get triggered. This is the persecutor, rescuer, and victim triangle, the drama triangle. And this is the example would be that dad's got a new job and he's got a report due on Friday, and Thursday night he's up at 2 in the morning. He doesn't know quite how to fill the report out. He ends up falling asleep at his desk and he wakes up late for work and his report's not done. So he goes to work and he has a miserable day, and his boss is wondering if he even hired the right guy, and he's riding him all day because it's a pretty critical boss. And so he comes home after this really strenuous week, and especially this very bad day on Friday, and he turns into the driveway, and there he finds little Johnny's bike in the driveway. And he's told Johnny a million times, take the bike out of the driveway so I can pull the car up into the garage when I get home. Well, he didn't do that. And then when Dad gets out of the car and moves the bike so he can pull the car up in the drive, he notices Johnny didn't do his chores. And Johnny's 12 years old. He's supposed to be doing chores. He's got these new chores, and he's supposed to keep them up. Well, he hasn't been doing them, and so that's strike two. Dad goes inside with this miserable week that he's had, and he unloads on Johnny, who's just sitting in the house waiting for Dad to get home. Well, Johnny starts crying because Dad's jumping all over him, and he's just waiting for Dad to get home. Well, Mom comes running in then and says, beats up on Dad. You're not going to beat up on Johnny because you had a bad day or a bad week. And then Dad feels like a victim, and Mom's persecuting Dad for beating up on Johnny and with his shaming him and so forth. And so Dad feels like a victim and says, I'm just trying to teach the boy work ethic. And then Mom and Dad get in a big fight. And so then Johnny starts jumping all over Mom for jumping all over Dad, who was jumping all over Johnny. So it's not really the roles that we play, it's the shifting of those roles that create the drama triangle. And those all come from these protector parts. And the protector parts are the fight parts, the submit parts, and then there are the exiles. The persecutor and the rescuer are driven by angry outbursts. The persecutor has angry outbursts, inner critic, demanding, punitive. And then the rescuer is that part that wants to keep everyone happy, the submit part. And it's a people-pleasing, approval-seeking, self-sacrificing, fixing, and rescuing part that can fly into action. And the victim then is what we call in IFS, we call that the exiles. That's the wounded inner child, if you will. That's the one that carries the burden of abandonment, shame, and contempt. The other two are managers or protectors, the persecutor and the rescuer. They're there to protect and manage other people's impressions and so forth. And when things get out of control, then the victim starts to get reactive with anxiety and phobias and panic attacks. And that's the freeze part. And that's from the wounded inner child. And the attachment parts are all about connection and fearing abandonment. So that's the vulnerable, needy part of our personality. And there's this strong fear of abandonment because there's an accumulation of abandonment by now. So when things get out of control, then the fight or flight parts come in. That's where the ruminator comes up with these parts that are going to try and give us some comfort and relief and help us get off of the hamster wheel, if you will, or put out the flames. That's why they call these the firefighters, because they're just concerned with the emergency right now and putting out the flames, and they don't care about the past or the future. They're just in the now. And so that can be a kid in a candy store without parental supervision. But these are the problem focused parts, and these are not helpful. These end up making things worse. So next time we're going to look a little bit closer at what to do about it. I think we've gone a little over 30 minutes already, so I'm not going to get to all the things that we need to do, but in the next video we will take a look at that. Thanks for listening. Watch this video a few times and remember to watch part 1.